I'm Eric Isaacs, president of the Carnegie Institution for Science. We're really honored here tonight to be your hosts for this conversation between two of the most interesting and influential thinkers of our time. For more than a century, this institution, Carnegie Institution for Science, has been working at the forefront of scientific research. And over the years, our scientists have made discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, the universe, and life itself. Today, our scientists continue to explore the most profound questions in life, earth, and space sciences, fulfilling our mission, Carnegie's original mission, of investigation, research, and discovery, and the application of that knowledge to the improvement of humankind. But at this critical moment for science in our country, we realize that our responsibility for the advancement of American science goes beyond our own research activities, and we also have a duty to reach out to the broader community and to build an even stronger foundation for our country's scientific enterprise. To that end, we invite the community to join us for wide-ranging lectures and public conversations like this one here that showcase some of the most important ideas and greatest challenges facing us today. Tonight, we're really extremely proud to present this conversation between two leaders whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of technology and the way in which it shapes our lives. Walter Isaacson, who is a Carnegie trustee, serves as a professor of history at Tulane University in his hometown of New Orleans. From 2003 to 2017, Walter was the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, which is a nonpartisan educational and policy studies organization, where he is now a distinguished fellow. Under his leadership, the Aspen Institute established a global reputation as an intellectual destination where a diverse group of leaders from every sector gather to address some of the world's most complex and pressing problems. During Walter's distinguished career as a journalist, he served as editor of Time magazine and as chairman of CNN. He is the author of a number of best-selling books, including The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution, as well as acclaimed biographies of Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, and Albert Einstein. Our guest tonight, Eric Schmidt, is a technical advisor and former executive chairman of Alphabet, the parent holding company for Google. He served as Google's CEO from 2001 to 2011, and then as company's chairman from 2011 to 2015. With his guidance, Google grew from a Silicon Valley startup with a few hundred employees into a global technology powerhouse that we know today. From 2009 to 2017, Eric was a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, which gives counsel to the White House on a wide range of policy issues, including climate change and cybersecurity. Today, Eric is a visiting innovation fellow at MIT, where he is advising the newly launched MIT Intelligence Quest, an institute-wide initiative to pursue hard problems on the horizon of intelligence research. He also is a leader in science philanthropy through the Schmidt Family Foundation, Schmidt Futures, and the Schmidt Ocean Institute. He is the co-author of two books, The New Digital Age, Transforming Nations, Businesses, and Our Lives, and How Google Works. This promises to be a really interesting, fascinating conversation, so please join me in welcoming Walter Isaacson and Eric Schmidt to the stage.
Thank you very much for doing this. I'm going to start with a bit of a public service announcement about this room and this place, if you don't mind, which is when Vannevar Bush was here during World War II, he used this place and even this room as he helped organize the government and academia and the private sector to help win World War II. Not only were things like the Manhattan Project started here, but things like the first computer, ENIAC, all the things that led to our current age. It was done because Vannevar Bush believed very strongly in what he wrote about in a paper called Science, the Endless Frontier, was that basic research would lead to the inventions that would keep America competitive in its economy and innovative in its society. And that is what the Carnegie Institute has been dedicated to. That's something that Eric Schmidt has been living the life of. And I'll begin by saying one part of his introduction is that he worked at one of the embodiments of this type of ideal, which was Bell Labs, and so did Eric Isaacs. And Bell Labs, among the things they invented were the laser and the transistor. And they did so because they brought together people of very diverse backgrounds and ways of thinking into a room and into a campus in which both government funding and academic research and the private sector work together. That has been lost a bit in this day and age, and I'm going to ask Eric about America's competitive advantage. But one of the things about Google is it's one of the great corporations that decided it had to dedicate itself not just to the research and development of its products, but to basic science. So let me begin, Eric, by talking about this notion of from the bench to the applications, from basic science to what we do. How important is that chain that Vannevar Bush talked about?
Well, it's funny because as a young scientist, you don't realize the gifts that you got from your predecessors. But I got pretty much everything from Mr. Bush. Because think about it. My initial grants were from the National Science Foundation. All the people that I worked with did that. Because of those grants, I got access to Bell Labs. Bell Labs then gave me a way of getting to Xerox PARC, which gave me a way to get a career, right? It wouldn't have happened without that stair step. And I am always worried that that stair step is getting harder to go up as opposed to easier. If you want to increase American prosperity, economics, stock price, whatever it is you care about, the fastest way to do so is to increase the rate of the acceleration of people into the kind of consequential outcomes where they can invent new industries, so forth. All economic progress has fundamentally occurred because of technological progress, and that's the sort of origin. So it really does start with basic science.
Yeah, and I know Larry Page and Sergey Brin, your colleagues, former colleagues, would agree because they were on National Science Foundation grants when they were graduate students at Stanford.
Well, it's important to say that Google came from original funding from a digital libraries project in the 1990s. And so you sit there and you go, wow, that's interesting. The early self-driving car work was from, again, a government grant in 1997, 1998, right? So in my world, and all sorts of critics say, well, they have lots of money and so forth. The money that my industry has is not going to the basic research. It's going to more applied research and innovation. Somebody's got to fund the basic research. And that's the thing that has driven America to have 18 of the top 20 universities and all of the benefits from it.
Are you worried that we're pulling back both as a corporate way, because the Xerox PARCs and Bell Labs aren't there anymore, and as a government from basic research?
So it's useful to have the numbers. And so while we were on PCAST, and John is here, who was our
John Holdren,
our fearless leader, along with some of our other members.
There were other Johns in the audience who were preening. I just wanted to make sure.
We actually looked at this question, and the peak of this funding occurred now 7 or 8 years ago, and some of the greatest cuts in funding occurred to the National Institutes for Health, which is, by the way, makes exactly no sense because the society is getting older and the sort of drugs and solutions are more prevalent there. So again, there's a misalignment of something here. Now today the funding has been, thanks to expert work in the Congress, has been essentially kept flat, even under great political pressure from people who were just fundamentally wrong. Mm-hmm. So thank you for your help.
And if you look at the rise of basic science, it was actually Eisenhower who loves what he calls my scientists. And so much of what happened, whether it was the creation of DARPA and eventually the internet, or the creation of surface state studies that led to the microchip, it was all done through this basic science, and even the Human Genome Project, which comes later, leads to the basic science that then eventually leads to the...
And you sit there and you think, so let's go through what really happened in the DARPA case. So Bob Taylor, who recently passed away, was my boss at Xerox, and he was the program director of the particular DARPA project, ARPA at the time, that did this. And he explained to me that what he did is they thought this would be an interesting project. So there was a small community, and they all got together, and they had this conversation. It was packet routing had just been invented. And they said, there must be a military way we can define this so we can do what we want. Right? And the system was flexible enough right, that Bob and the people he worked with could say, yes, building a redundant communications network has a military purpose, and therefore was properly and legitimately functioned. And what a great thing that the DARPA did.
There's a little tale, if you don't mind me telling it, which when I was doing the Innovators, I talked to Bob Taylor about this. And the original graduate students who did the packet switch network protocols and TCP/IP with Vint and Bob Kahn, they were all graduate students, and Time magazine had written that it was done to survive a Russian nuclear attack because, as you say,
that was the cover story.
That was a cover story. Well, it's trickier than that because, so Time writes, and we get a letter saying, well, no, you don't remember, we were graduate students then. Why were we graduate students? Because we were avoiding the draft. We weren't there to help the Pentagon avoid a nuclear attack. And so Time didn't print the letter, and so I eventually went to Steve Crocker, who was one of the original, and Bob Lukasich, who worked there, said, oh no, we were doing it, that's the only way we get the money out of the colonels at the Pentagon, but you know, these people were on the bottom and I was on the top, so we didn't tell them because they were all draft dodgers. And so I told that to Crocker and Bob Taylor, and they said, you tell Lukasich that we were on the bottom and he was on the top. He didn't know what was happening.
That's right.
And they kept it decentralized so it could not be controlled.
So there's a good example of really, really clever people who 50 years ago created something which has been the largest creation of wealth in certainly recent history in the world. And think about today, the 5 most valuable companies in the United States, the 3 most valuable companies in China are internet or internet-related companies, right? So think about it. You want to sort of understand why this stuff matters. 50 years later, they're the leading corporations impacting society in all sorts of ways. Let's think about the GPS. Again, a military program which had commercial use, and then eventually this notion of inaccurate non-defense use was eliminated, and so you could have accurate GPS, and then today you use this. And how do you use your GPS? That's how you call the equivalent of an Uber or a Lyft, right? Mm-hmm. Created another $100 billion worth of corporations, and more if you include China. So we forget that over a 50-year period how far these things are.
Let me go to the dark side a little, though, when we were talking about the internet and all the wealth it created, and it was also there to connect us and make us more cohesive and unified. In the past couple of years, it seems that we've discovered that the internet can be as problematic as it is useful.
So when I was at Berkeley, I helped build the first university internet, and I wrote one of the first email programs. And my contribution was the -R flag, which allowed you to impersonate anyone else you could think of. Mm-hmm. So to say that we were naive in our understanding in the 70s, that this thing would be a problem, would be an understatement. Now today, if you went back, you'd say maybe you should have a security architecture for the internet that really did not allow for spoofing, where man-in-the-middle attacks were not possible, and so forth and so on. But it never occurred to us because it was developed in a collaborative university setting. And we knew there were bad people, but they were never going to be in our network, right? And so it was sort of a shock. Today, of course, I think one of the great challenges of the internet is that the internet is, about half the world uses the internet, which means there's another half to go. And we need to make the internet secure against these kinds of attacks. When you're dealing with something in the internet, it needs to be who that person or institution really needs to be, right? The use of the internet is no longer optional. And for many years, people like myself would say, well, just turn it off. You can't turn it off now. It's too fundamental to economic growth, to your health, to your education, and to, especially in the developing world, where it's their primary thing that's driving knowledge and education and so forth and so on.
So would it be wise and would it be possible to create an optional version of the internet in which you had totally secure ID, you couldn't put fake news, you had everything authenticated?
So there's a lot of people have looked at this, and you would not be a separate internet. What you have to do is figure out services that provide more accurate identification. This is generally known as the real ID problem. And you want to make sure that the internet can authenticate somebody, but also you want to allow for non-authenticated uses. right? Because if it becomes only authenticated, then there's a whole bunch of uses where people want to be anonymous that aren't allowed. And then the industry could organize itself around, well, these people are authenticated and these people are not. And by the way, you see this a little bit. If you look at Twitter today, you'll see authenticated accounts and non-authenticated accounts. Now, here's a hint. The ones that are not authenticated are almost certainly robots, right? The ones that are authenticated might be robots, okay? We don't know if they're human, but we at least know they came from a human of some kind who had some kind of driver's license. So there's a lot of subtle design in here. But put it another way, I am strongly in favor of free speech for humans. For humans.
For authenticated humans, or should you have anonymous free speech?
If they're actually humans, they can be non-authenticated.
And anonymous.
Yes.
And say whatever they want.
No, and you need
Why?
Because you need anonymous speech in any form of human society as serve as a check and balance. But you also need to recognize that anonymous speech can be manipulative. And that's the key lesson, I think, that we've seen around.
Vince Cerf, who was one of the people who did the TCP/IP protocols we were talking about, ended up working for you at Google for a long time.
He's a great hero.
A truly great hero and an elegant gentleman. But if you ask him, what was the mistakes you made? He said, we made one mistake. We put in the protocols how to address a packet as it scurried through, but we didn't encode the origin of where it came from. Can you fix that?
I'm sure, well, technologically, I'm sure we can. The underlying protocols are in such hardware now, you probably can't change the underlying protocols, but you can put a service layer above that can provide that service. In general, if you have a complaint about the internet, there's a softer way of solving it. The question then is how do you get adoption? And before people say, well, hey, I want a real ID authenticated internet, you might not want the society that does not allow dissidence. You might want anonymous speech to be protected. So don't give up the freedoms. We want.
But wait, we have half the world almost now being in China and the countries in which China will help control the wall around the internet, in which you don't have the dissident able to be anonymous. And then our half, Western Europe and the United States and North America, we do allow the dissidents. It seems we've got that backwards.
Well, I suspect everybody in this room, and certainly I believe that it's very important to maintain the open principles of the internet, right? It's very important to fight against the natural closing off of the variation of humanity. It's important to be able to hear these people, even if you don't like them. I just want to make sure that they're people and not robots. So my concern is that the weaponization of the internet, which we see all around us, can really be used to manipulate people. And I'm not suggesting a return to fascism, which many people have claimed. What I'm suggesting is I want there to be a basic trust between us. I want us, if you appear to say something, I want it to actually be you. And modern technologies allow you to spoof text, to spoof voice, and to spoof videos, and that's not a good situation. So we've got to make sure that we've got appropriate architectures that prevent that. We know that we're really dealing with human beings.
If you got to invent a new social network, how would you design it?
Well, a lot of people have tried that. In fact, that's the #1 startup of students coming out of colleges, and they always fail.
I have lots of students, and they ask me to ask you this question.
And most of the teams that I've talked with say they have a variant on what they see on either Twitter or on Facebook. I've always thought that the most interesting social network that you could build would be one that used AI to make you smarter. In other words, what's new now that wasn't true 10 years ago is the prevalence of machine learning and the ability to sort of become smarter. And I think there's probably interesting social networks to be built. Maybe they're vertical as opposed to horizontal, maybe they're specialized, where they really have special knowledge and the communications are enhanced in all sorts of really fun ways.
How will machine learning and artificial intelligence drive science?
Well, this is, on a personal basis, this is where I've decided to spend my initial round of philanthropic effort. And the argument goes something like this. So machine learning and AI today can be understood as one trick. It's a very powerful trick. And that trick is to look back in the history of a data stream and discover hidden patterns And with those hidden patterns, begin to predict what the next thing. So if you take a series of numbers, you can predict the next numbers and so forth. And through that mechanism, and then something called deep learning, which was invented about 20 years ago by a professor at Toronto who works at Google now and a number of other people, you can build layers of these networks. And the sum of those networks allow you to do, for example, recognition. So today, for example, computers are better at video recognition than humans. And video is a pretty big deal. Video in the sense of pictures and images and so forth. And remember, voice is a picture, sound is a picture in this context. So that ability to do that recognition better than humans means, for example, that when you go to the doctor should use an AI tool to scan you, because that tool will be more accurate than the doctor. It also means that you should be driving in a car that is powered fundamentally by vision systems that are, because the car can't get drunk and you can, kind of an argument. And we joke about it, but there are 33,000 people who will die on the roads of America in the next year, and they just don't know who they are yet. I mean, it's a terrible thing, right? So anything we can do to get deaths down on things like cars and so forth is really, really fundamental. So the key wins so far in AI have been in this area of video and imaging and so forth, and in gaming. The next big phenomena are called GANs, generative adversarial networks, which can actually generate information. And the classic example here is they took a bunch of pictures of actresses and they taught it what an actress looked like, and they asked it to produce a picture of an actress. You look at the picture of the actress and you say, I'm sure I know who she is, because she seems so familiar. And that mechanism, which is just a demo of the power, means that you can begin to generate sort of understanding from looking at collections of data. And that's the beginning of real intelligence. Now, for science, much of science is really an awful lot of data where scientists have a hunch. So my sort of standard line on this is you work at a pharmaceutical company, and in the morning you wake up and you have a hunch. And your hunch is that this particular enzyme and this particular chemical can be merged. And in the afternoon, you get your postdocs to merge it, and by 6 o'clock, it has produced red instead of blue, and you go home and you eat dinner and you go to sleep, okay? Wouldn't it be better at that 6 o'clock point, you said to the computer, well, that one didn't work, show me every single possible adjacent ideas that's anywhere near this anyone has ever had in the entire world. And you know the computer has plenty of time because you're sleeping, right? So 12 hours later, you come back, and it's done a scanned analysis of all the different choices. One of my physicist friends said, I was talking about physics, which I know very little about, and he said, you obviously don't understand physics. And I said, okay, we get that. And he said, no, you don't understand how you do physics. The problem with physics now is there's so many papers, not even I, referring to himself, can read them. All I want you to do is to read the papers. Well, that's a problem that looks a lot like a vision problem. That begins to look like something where we can produce candidates. So the way to think about it in science is AI is not going to replace the scientist. It becomes a powerful tool for the science. So there are lots and lots of examples. I can go on about this, but I'm funding a project in Caltech. Again, I won't do justice to the math here, but the Navier-Stokes equations in climate change do not allow a resolution of a little bit better than 10 by 10 kilometers squares. And my answer, of course, was make the computers faster. But in fact, because of Moore's law essentially stopping in terms of progression and so forth, there's a real problem in the modeling area. So here's a case where you can do training of those little squares, and using intuition, you can get close enough to get a closer solution. So you have the classic math, and then when you get to the hard problem, you use a training and machine learning solution to help move the solution forward. I think most of the interesting science solutions will look like that. In other words, the analytical tools have gotten us to this point, but now we have too much data to do an analytical solution, and we'll do this. I'll give you another example, and this is a bizarre one. People are so clever. So one of the labs that I'm familiar with wanted to determine if mice were sleeping. And this is a difficult problem, apparently, if you're in the mice research department. And so the question was, what is the configuration that a mouse sleeps in? And the answer turned out to be that we don't have enough training data to do this. I said, well, so obviously AI can't apply. But they understand physics, and they understand the possible configurations of the legs and the arms, or whatever they're called, of mice, and the tail. So they built a simulation of a mouse, and they ran all the different models in possible sleeping states, and they generated data, which they then used to train a recognition algorithm. So that's one level past what I just said. So the first one was, we have all the data, right? And lots of these people in biology, they have enormous amounts of data. Astronomy, go on and on. But now we have the ability to generate data, especially if these GANs work, that we can begin to do things that are possibly more powerful.
Are there things that the human brain, with its carbon-based analog wetware, will always do better than a digital system?
Well, let me ask you a question. How is it the human brain does its work with 20 watts, and we need about a megawatt to do almost none of what the human does? So let's take a moment and imagine the majesty of what I just said. So the top scientists in the world are 5 orders of magnitude off in power, and they're not anywhere, they're still 5 orders of magnitude against the achievement. That shows you how powerful human brains are. So it's easy to, so let's go through the list. We can probably do routine tasks that are highly predictable as well or better than machines. How do I know that? It's been true for 30 years in the Midwest in manufacturing, right? All those difficult and unpleasant jobs in manufacturing were replaced by essentially trained robotic arms that would do the same thing over and over so that your arm wouldn't end up in the hospital. So there's probably a fair amount of that. But for the stuff that requires intuition, judgment, and really hardcore creativity, we don't know how long until. You know, everyone's seen the movie, right? And in the movie, the computer can not only do this, but the movie is typically a female robot that slays the male inventor who's difficult, right? We are so far from that. So I'll give you another example. When you ask people, what is the #1 problem they would like a robot to do in their house, inevitably they say, clean up the dishes.
Which is impossible for a robot. Almost.
And it turns out that cleaning up the dishes is one of the hardest problems. Yeah. Because it requires judgment and placing and recognition and manipulation, and there are people working on that. So don't worry, it will get solved. But if we can't clean up the dishes, we're not going to be building Terminator robots anytime soon, right?
Von Neumann, who was connected to this institution to some extent, set us down a path in the creation of computers that was now known as the von Neumann architecture. Did we go down the wrong path? Should we have tried something that was more like a carbon-based wetware system?
So lots of people have looked at this, and they've all failed so far, right? So it looks like the genius of biology and the brain is not well enough and understood by us to be mimicked or replicated. There are, again, people working hard in neuroscience institutes over and over again. One of the sort of arguments that I would make about AI is neuroscientists now have such good fMRI detectors and other ways of watching what's going on in your brain that they have an overload of information. Surely that's a good case where AI can help us understand what your brain is up to. So in that sense, it can be used to advance it. The problem on the von Neumann architecture model is that we've hit the limits, the physics limits. And again, Craig, who's in the front row, is literally the world's expert on this. But the rough way it's been explained to me is that we're now at 10 nanometers, 7 nanometers. The scale and size of the fabs is so large and the layers is so difficult that there's not enough of a gain to generate enough money to fund this whole next thing. So we're kind of stuck. And what's happening in our industry is that there's new specialized architectures coming along and a great deal of parallelism. So don't worry, right? Scientists are working hard, but they're being forced to do things which are well past the original conception from von Neumann.
I'm going to actually ask Craig to ask the first question in a few minutes so you can
explain.
defend your colleague Gordon Moore and others.
You can explain all this better than me.
Okay. So unlike your friend Bill Joy and a few others, you don't sit up at night worrying about a singularity in which the machines will leave us behind.
I think those are all matters of speculation. I'm still trying to get the dishes put away.
Yeah, right.
There are people that at Google who wrote a paper last month, which I'll summarize it, roughly said that the trick, which is this incredibly powerful trick, right, that's transformed our industry. So I say trick in a euphemistic way. It's obviously incredibly powerful. We've transformed our corporation around this, has some limits. And there are now researchers who are beginning to think about what those limits are and then what is needed above that. My intuition is as well that we won't get to general intelligence on computers, which is the goal, until we can figure out a few more tricks. And by the way, those tricks come in the way science always does, through randomness, through serendipity, through good luck, through
basic research leading to things we didn't expect.
It's funny that gradient descent, which is the basis of machine learning, which powers so much of my industry, was actually invented mathematically many, many decades ago, but the seminal papers were written in the 1970s and 80s, right, when the math was developed. So let's start by saying the mathematicians get it right first, right, because they live in an abstract world. And then that abstract world becomes close enough that maybe the physicists can apply it, right? And then finally, people like myself are the beneficiaries of that incredibly work. Let's continue that feedstock. I am worried that we're forgetting that formula, right, as a country and as a world. I'll give you another example. Let's talk about what the world looks like in 100 years, right? Well, today there's roughly 7.3 billion people. 2050, there'll be roughly 9.5, maybe 11 billion in 2100 if we don't annihilate ourselves. And what will be true of all those people? First, they're going to have infinitely better connectivity. Think about incredible bandwidth among and between them all. And second, they're all going to want the equivalent of cars, houses, freeways, good food, entertainment, and so forth and so on. How are we going to deliver that to them in a sustainable way? We're going to have research and innovation to handle that load, right, in a good way, right, in a sustainable way. And that means in ecological processes, it means in dealing with the issues of climate change, dealing with renewable systems, and so forth and so on. There's clearly huge breakthroughs to be had, for example, in education. I'll give you my favorite example. In education is why do we not have, I'll pick kindergartners, a smart toy that helps them with language achievement. Mm-hmm. Now, who would be the customer of that? Why don't we give it to all the children who have been, who live in homes where they're not rich enough to have the kind of enrichment that the rich kids get? Why don't we use that to kind of level their opportunity as young members of our society? Let's give them, make the same argument in middle school and in high school. You get the idea. I'll give you another example.
That's what the internet was supposed to do,
well,
equalize the field, but it didn't.
But that's because the people who built the internet were, shall we say, idealistic and nice people. And the fact of the matter is, none of us understood that when everybody was on the internet, it would begin to look like human society, which is obvious if you think about it.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so let's just say we were wrong and reality set in. But now we have an opportunity to fix it. My favorite quote is, with great power comes great responsibility, which of course comes from Spider-Man. Speaking of which, since you're a historian and my favorite historian, I was trying to look about something about science. Amid the din of war and the heat of the party, the deviltries of politics and the poisons of hypocrisy, science will be inaudible, incapable, incoherent, and inanimate. Benjamin Pierce, founder of the National Academy of Sciences, 1863. So when you spend your time complaining about how things are right now, imagine during the Civil War.
Yeah. So tell me, since we're in a competition now in this world, all those things you talked about, from education to funnel into American competitiveness, the seed corn that Vannevar Bush talked about of basic research. Are you worried that America could be losing its competitive advantage? And if so, what would you do?
Well, let's try to understand how the competitiveness is playing out right now. There are parts of this where the dynamic nature of venture capital has filled in the valley, right? So historically, I'll give you a rough number. It's sort of 10 years from the start of something to its productization. It's less in the internet and more in some other fields, but let's say 10 years. So what would typically happen is you'd have some number of years of development, which would be done at a nice stately pace in a research lab like at Bell Labs where I worked, and then it would be either built by, in that case, the Bell companies, or be transferred through some other program or so forth into corporate labs. As the corporate labs became less effective, including Bell Labs, unfortunately, a new group of showed up, which is the startups. So if you look at biotech, for example, the extraordinary discovery of the genome enabled, again, 15 years of new biotech companies. And I'm sure, for example, if you look, for example, the Broad and others are building something called the Cell Atlas, which is a list of all the cells in the body. And there are people who are talking about, with the Cell Atlas and with our understanding of genetics, we can begin to understand the actual language of biology. That is, how does it actually work? And so the combination of the language of biology, in the sense of a programming language, and CRISPR, again, at scale and assuming it works and so forth, you could begin to address things that have bedeviled us for all of history, diseases and other problems that everybody has to deal with. So there's huge potential there. So I think that we have this venture model, which is filling in some of it. Mm-hmm. The concern I would have is, from a competitiveness, is where is the other place where this level of investment and dynamism is occurring? And the answer is in China. And they're doing a fantastic job, right? So it's an interesting statistic are that 9 of the 20 top internet companies are in China, 11 in the United States, right? More PhDs. I think you know some of the other numbers. But the important point is the dynamism and investment in China is a worthy competitor that we need to sort of be dealing with. And the best way to do is to collaborate, right, and grow this thing, right? We need
collaborate with China?
Absolutely. And so as they make advances in research, we need to get those advantages, and similarly in reverse.
Do they have more people now working on machine learning and artificial intelligence than we do?
They're certainly producing more papers and more PhDs.
Are they collaborating with us on any of it?
I don't know very well. I think there's certainly a great deal of collaboration at the technical conferences. I don't know beyond that. But that would be an example where we could collectively move forward with more collaboration.
But isn't there, both in this country and perhaps in China, a resistance for fear of spying or stolen intellectual property?
Well, sure, but the question, and it's obviously not a good thing, we have tools and techniques to cryptographically secure things. They're just not very well implemented. So my advertisement here is, if you're worried about these things, use Chrome and use Gmail, right? And use two-factor, and then you'll be fine. But
I'm not just talking about them sort of hacking into the emails. I'm talking about the fact that if Chinese students come here and learn everything about AI and take it back there are people who feel that's not a great thing.
Yeah, but the counter-argument, if you follow that line of reasoning, then you would put a wall or a wall between the two countries and not allow the extraordinary trade and the extraordinary trade of ideas.
There are people talking about building walls.
I am strongly in favor of more engagement, more communications, and more sharing, because I think it lifts the human opportunity. And sure, you have to address those issues, but I don't think we should shut down the collaborations. We got to where we are because of international collaborations in Europe, right? So let's give the Europeans, who I haven't mentioned, a lot of the science was invented there 100 years ago. Let's give them some credit.
But do you feel that in, say, the life sciences, you talked about CRISPR, there are less restrictions on what's going to be done in China? I think they've already done it in embryos, which is not, I can ask John Holdren, but I think generally not permitted here. Do you worry that we have the same set of values that we can share so that we can do everything from cloning and life science and CRISPR, genetic engineering and artificial intelligence together?
I do. I still think it's better if we're communicating and educating and trying to improve them as well as ourselves. I really do.
Tell me what your philanthropy wants to do early on.
Well, my personal goal has been around AI-enabled science. And so we are, there are many, many examples that we have been looking at. The most interesting targets are all in genetics, biology, and in things like climate change and astronomy, because of the amounts of data that they have.
You and I, but I work under you on this, have been part of the Defense Innovation Board. This is a nonpartisan board that started under Ash Carter and has continued. Do you feel that the U.S. military is making strides towards innovation?
Well, I hope so. That was the charter that you and I were given. As a bit of history, there's a group called the Defense Innovation Board that was set up by Secretary Carter that Secretary Mattis has continued. It's a group of sort of the usual suspects in my world, and we are trying to identify ways in which the military can advance innovation. The number one priority that we gave them was artificial intelligence, and indeed a few months ago they announced a joint AI center. Joint for them means it's across all the services in an AI center that they are funding. The military has many, many needs for AI. The simplest example is that most of our soldiers spend most of their time looking at things. And it's pretty mind-numbing work, and these are exquisitely well-trained men and women who serve our nation. Wouldn't it be better if they had an AI tool that could do the looking, watching, which they'll do better than they, and then give an alert like, hey, something happened.
Yeah, or this kid on a motorcycle that we've been tracking has now emerged. Well, thank you for serving there, because I think that sometimes we forget how important it is, for science to be put in the service of good things. Let me open it up as we said we would, and I'm gonna, unless you wave me off, Craig, I will start with you because we disparaged slightly Moore's Law for a moment. And you, for those who don't know, Craig Barrett ran Intel for quite a decade.
I think his
or so,
entire
right?
career.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Andy Grove didn't know that he was running it for a while. No, I'm joking.
Can we get Craig a mic? Could somebody
grab a microphone,
Could somebody grab a
please,
mic and hand it to Craig?
Will somebody pick up that mic and bring it up front? Thank you. Oh, it's wired.
Oh, it's wired.
All
You're
right.
going to have to stand
you
up.
You have a loud voice. Just
okay,
ask
so
your
speak
question,
to the audience.
and I'll repeat it.
Well, a couple comments. First of all, I agree with Eric on AI.
Yeah.
Some interesting notes here that I can read to you. I just want to say I agree with Eric on the importance of AI and such. I don't necessarily totally agree with him on the death of Moore's Law. It's been announced its death decade after decade after decade. We could never go below 1 micron. We're 100 times smaller than that now. It's getting a little more tougher. The signal to noise ratios are a challenge. I guess the real challenge there is to get off the classic CMOS transistor and into a different electronic switch. It's electron spin or quantum bits and that sort of thing. And I think the rest of the structure, other than the switch, carries on, the interconnect and all that other good stuff.
Will quantum computing truly be a quantum leap?
You're the master of words, Walter.
I didn't invent the word quanta.
No, I suspect that will be more generational rather than a quantum leap. I mean, Moore's Law has been going since the mid-'60s. It's hardly anything doubles every year or two for 60 years.
Well, by the way, thank you for doing it. It paid for my house, my kids' education.
It also paid for my house and my kids' education. I guess I'm interested in going a bit deeper into the issue of the next generation of basic research and the ideas that come out of that, because the venture capital world has become anti-venture, and it's really looking for the instantaneous gratification of 100 million customers overnight for some social software application. Very little of it goes into the infrastructure items of the 80s and 90s, the sort of things that Intel and other companies were doing at that time. So how do we get beyond that? And basic research funding is a bit, but there's very little to take the germs of ideas into a product, and then that 5 or 10 year incubation to get it out.
In fact, one of the problems that's new is that we've been studying this, the initial grant that a principal investigator gets used to be when they were in their early 30s and is now 42 or 43. And these are averages. So you have somebody who gets a PhD, becomes a postdoc, and then spends 10 years essentially struggling for money during their most creative period. So part of my answer is we've got to come up with ways of getting more money in the period of time when those people can build teams that would address the issues that are perhaps not as sexy as the social network scenario that you described, but are fundamental to making the internet more robust, making clean energy, dealing with water, the kinds of things that we're going to need for 11 billion people in 100 years.
Over there.
Hi, my name is Arthur Collet. I'm curious about your stance on things like Project Maven. You spoke a little bit about, AI's use in warfare and obviously like it being used as a tool to help people make informed decisions. But I mean, I for one, lived on a lot of like science fiction when I was growing up, and I think it's pretty scary that we're, at a time when the technology is nearing, relative adoption in terms of deep learning technologies for image recognition, all these things. Like, are we at a point where military technology in a few years will be able to like independently make like killing decisions?
So putting my military hat on, because I'm a consultant to the military, sure. The military has an express policy precisely that's not okay, illegal, and wrong. And it's actually a written doctrine, which I've actually got somewhere. And the argument is pretty easy to understand. Even the best of AI systems that I've seen are not accurate enough to do anything that's life critical. Right? They need to be backed up, in the case of the military, by chain of command.
Yeah, but the military frequently says a lot of things and then does another, right? Like the NSA spying.
Not as much as you would think.
I want to be very clear here. Sure. This is a law, and the military does follow the law, and I've seen the law. So I know what I just said. They'll be, if they were to violate that principle, something really bad would happen to the individual. So I know they take it seriously.
But let me press your question a little bit further, because I think it's a good question. You answered by saying, well, it's because the machines aren't quite good enough. But one could imagine a time when the machines are quite good enough. Morally, should there always be a human in the equation?
I believe so. But remember, once upon a time, you said you could imagine a future. I can imagine a time when these systems can put my dishes away. So we don't know when we're going to face this question, but most ethicists believe that anything that involves these kinds of critical decisions should be made by humans and under some chain of command and governance and so forth. And I'm not endorsing it, but I'm trying to say that's the consensus of the people, and certainly my view.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elias, and I also just want to keep pressing that a little bit. I think part of the concern is beyond just the idea of like the actual decision. I think we give a lot of credence to technologies, and maybe that can become misplaced. The targeting, like the idea of bringing up a list of targets and saying, okay, well, the AI has suggested that these are the individuals. Do you think you should we execute these people with a drone from the sky? I think that part of it is the very the targeting that comes up. Like, is it any better that they just go, oh yeah, well, I trust this AI, so I'm going to do it? Is that rubber stamp enough? Especially when you're dealing with so much data, and the whole idea of using the AI is to sift through that data and provide you options and data that you yourself can't look at. Aren't you just going to trust that machine learning is going to produce the right result?
It's a more detailed military question than I know exactly how to answer. I can say in general terms, the the data is not accurate enough at any level to be able to give you an absolute answer in any of the scenarios that I've seen. In other words, at the end of the day, nations, governments, and so forth, they're dealing with areas of confusion.
Let me ask you a question. Do you
Yeah,
think an unmanned drones are moral?
That, I don't know if, the morality of it is a bit confusing. I'm not sure if it's necessary, because like, when you fire a gun, I mean, like the projectile becomes disconnected from you. I'm not sure if that's the problem. I'm not sure as a way of fighting terrorists if it's like overly radicalizing as like as a strategy. Like that would be my main concern. So yeah, there's that. Like because we're not risking our own skin, other people see that, and it's deeply disturbing to them. And like the relative, radicalization. I mean, that would be my main concern. But the question that I came up with, I would prefer to ask a question about like AI and maybe it's like its relationship with how we understand like concepts and other things. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Project Dragonfly and whether you would join groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Reporters Without Borders, and 1,400 Google employees in rejecting and saying that this is not how we should be working with China to make a spy device, pretty much, for the Chinese government.
We have many people have now lined up. I think he knows what the question is. So let me let him answer it if you don't mind.
Or you would prefer if that was not that Google stopped that? Would you join?
I think he knows what your question is. Let's see if he wants to answer it.
I'm not the chairman nor the CEO of the company anymore.
Yes,
so.
Moral obligation, just like Human Rights Watch doesn't operate it.
Yes, ma'am.
No, so you refuse to answer the question.
I think, let me step in there. It would be, you'll have to understand why it would be problematic for him right now in this position to start second-guessing a Google thing in a public forum. I'll let you say one more thing if you want. Yes, ma'am?
Who is next?
First,
who's
and then,
next?
let me go here first because they've been in line so long, and then right to you.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Leanne King, and I'm the geospatial program manager at the Chesapeake Conservancy in Annapolis, Maryland. What we've done at the Chesapeake Conservancy is created a 1-meter spatial resolution map of land cover. And we've worked closely with Microsoft to develop a land cover classification system with their AI capabilities. But we can't seem to get it right. We were talking about accuracy a few minutes ago, and the accuracy is just not great. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fine spatial resolution of the data, but also the fact that the definition for the classification of the land cover varies so much through space and time. And so do you have any recommendations on how to harness AI to be able to provide some kind of systematic approach to this? And also, sorry, one more.
No. We have 7 people lined up in 7 minutes, so we're in a lightning round. No, we're going to let Eric answer. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Let me see. The way I would normally solve this problem is that I would train a system based on the variation and then ask the system to renormalize the data. So in other words, you teach it, this is one, this is another, and these are the same. And then when you run it through the data again, it can cause the data to look the same or in the same normalization scheme. And that's typically how these problems are solved.
I'm sorry to have been so abrupt on that, but let's make it lightning rounds now because I'd rather make sure everybody can get in, and we only have a few more minutes. So quick questions.
Yes, I'm Kathy Gibbons, and the British Royal Astronomer was here recently, and he described himself as a technological optimist and a political pessimist. I'm wondering, given your role in government relations with Google and so forth, if you agree and if you think that the institutions we have and the legal structure we have is adequate to deal with your complicated, very concentrated industry and how we avoid being manipulated by it to the loss of individual, contract and privacy rights.
Well, our industry is very, very, very thoroughly regulated now by all sorts of laws, and I'm sure that there will be more over time globally. So There's no lack of regulation. There's no lack of meetings. There's no lack of culture. I think that one of the ways to say it is the system works pretty well now, and when there are problems, there's outrage, and the outrage is helpful because it gets it fixed, right? So as long as we're making progress addressing the natural innovation issues, I think it's fine. That is my actual view.
Hi, how are you? I have a question for Walter about Steve Jobs. Could you share with us something that, through your conversations with him, that would surprise us about him personally? You know?
I'll share a story that Eric can finish, because at one point he says to me that he's about to go nuclear on Google, that they ripped off the Android, and that he has coffee with Eric in a strip mall place in near Palo Alto, I think it was. And it was a complicated thing because he was truly angry about it in a way that was separate from what you would normally be in business competing against Android. He felt that this was an evil that had happened. And being the type of reporter that I was, I immediately then called Eric to get his side of it. And what I still don't quite understand is his over-the-top emotional reaction to you and to Google when you went into the Android business.
So I was on the board at the time, so
the board of Apple.
The board of Apple as well as the board of Google, and obviously the CEO.
Obviously, that
the CEO.
That had to end, but yes.
And as you would imagine. And I remember the lunch very well. We spent a good 45 minutes talking about personal things, how his health, and so forth and so on. And then he was very exercised over a couple of things that we'd done in Android. But I was used to him being exercised about things. And so, because Steve was a very, very passionate and brilliant man, and I adored him. And he obviously respected me enough to sort of yell at me profoundly.
In an outdoor cafe.
In an outdoor cafe. And I said, look, Steve, we'll work this out. And so I literally remember getting in the car, getting on the phone as I'm driving from Steve, saying how we're going to fix this and so forth. And we ultimately came to a reasonable resolution. So one of Steve's great geniuses, and again, you cover this in your book quite well, is he saw it, he knew it, right? And with that came this enormous energy. And that's why people love to work for him, right? He was a great leader, right? And we owe much of what we use today for his genius.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for a really great talk. You talked about the importance of funding basic research, and you also talked about the importance of keeping open our foreign exchange in terms of the intellectual exchange with other countries. What would you say about the idea that when the United States is putting a lot of emphasis on funding basic research, other countries are coming in to take the knowledge of the basic research and focusing their own investments in applied research? How do you suggest the United States stay ahead of the competitive curve given this type of situation?
Well, I believe that the leader in basic research becomes the leader in everything else. And I believe that the multicultural nature of America, combined with the money and the investment and the economic model, is what drives this all. So I still think the trick we use, right, which got us all to here, is still a good one, right? That plan that I described. I don't worry as much about other people following us. I just worry about being ahead of them as a country. So, one of the sort of basic rules is don't look at your competitors, try to figure out where you're going and be right. And in order to do that, you have to have the smartest people. So for example, we need to allow the smartest people to come to the country and shockingly stay in the country with their PhDs, right? And produce taxes and help produce these companies and so forth and so on. So I think there is a formula, and it was sort of understood 50 years ago. We sort of forgot it, which is super smart people all around the world, serious investment, a fair amount of tolerance for risk, a very robust venture model, which was invented by Arthur Rock and others with the founding of Intel and a few other places. And the rest works. There's no reason to think it's not going to work.
And a comfort with sort of multicultural talent.
Multiculturalism. And America has benefited from being a large U.S. domestic market and an even larger global market. And it's important to remember that those partnerships and globalization, we have benefited from that. It's easy to decry globalization because you see some of the effects. But I'd much rather have a globalized world than a nationalized world, right? Among other things, because it benefits us.
Thank you.
And that might be one of our competitive advantages against
just,
China or any other place, is that we're
absolutely.
more comfortable if we stay comfortable with that.
But again, what's our alternative? Multiculturalism is how we work. Diversity and inclusion and all the values I know we all agree with. Let's do more of it, not less of it. More tolerance. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Frida. I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm naturally interested in regulation and governance issues. The question is related to the ma'am before. So I'm actually kind of concerned about the pace of development and whether we as a global community can actually regulate, for instance, when it comes to freedom of speech that you alluded to earlier. So we have developments now to kind of manipulate elections, or we can put sort of words in the mouth of politicians when it comes to this whole fake news thing. So how can we
and fake videos now
control these kind of interferences? This is one, and very related to this. And I'm sorry, I'm being short. We also see developments like the social credit in China. So this is then also the question of maybe obligation or moral obligation as a global community. Can we let this happen, that basically dissidents or people that are being critical online, that they are not allowed to fly out of the country, for instance, anymore?
So as you heard, I said very clearly that I think any real ID system should allow for anonymous speech, which is directly relevant to what, so I think you and I would agree on that. So
I know there are several layers, I guess, to the question.
Yeah, and the first part of the question was?
How can we deal with the pace of development when it comes to
the overall pace? I think there's a lot of evidence that the pace of development is overtaking government's ability to regulate it, to see it, and so forth and so on. And you don't want to be surprising people. We work pretty hard to tell people what we're doing, which is better than not and surprising people. I guess what I really think is that things like the election hacking are errors in the internet, right? That the internet should not allow for that sort of thing, and that the proper internet, the next internet, will have figured out a way to allow modern society to run its elections and do that. And when I say errors, I mean we didn't anticipate that we would have these problems. That the notion of nation-state hacking was not on anybody's list even 10 years ago, let alone 5 years ago.
Is it up to the companies to fix that problem or the government?
Well, most of the engineering work on the internet is done in the private sector. One of the great things about the internet is the government helped fund the design, but the original internet before 1991 was non-commercial public use, right? And the military had its own networks, which were separate. But for the average researcher, they were all interconnected. And in 1991, there was a law passed that allowed commercial use of the internet. It was that law that created Netscape, which then created everything else in that sequence.
Tell us the name of the law.
I don't remember.
The Gore Act.
The Gore Act.
Meaning that Al Gore shouldn't take as much grief as he gets.
That's right. This is Al Gore led it. That's right. So, that decision to make the network be public did not change the fact that the internet was a collection of private businesses. And there was a group called the IETF, which I was a member of, which did a lot of the planning. Today, most of that work is still done by very, very big and very, very smart networking companies.
Our last question, make it good.
So I've got a question on sort of basic research. So you talked a lot about like funding for basic research is decreasing. What do you think the government should be funding? The
government should be funding the National Science Foundation, the National Academy of Sciences, and so forth. I think that the government itself is not particularly good at making these decisions, but the institutions that are aligned with the government have a fantastic track record.
But let me put a sharper point on this thing. You are there as, let us say, an advisor to the head of NIH. You're sitting around the room, and they say, okay, Eric, you get to pick 3 things you want us to go after. What are the 3?
Well, with NIH...
I'm sorry, NSF, NIH, both together.
Well, I think that the the things that are before us in biology and biology, genetics, and so forth are so powerful. That's my first answer.
But like tracking the brain, how it works, or tracking the genome?
I would again do a set of investments, but we're just about to get breakthroughs in how biology works. The second one would be brain research, because the mystery of the brain unlocks everything. And then what I think we should really do as a third one is trying to get this AI stuff to the next level, at the basic level. And I'm doing some of my own funding there. And here's why. If the system gets smarter, then that smarter system can be applied to help solve the problems. You get enormous leverage by taking these data systems and being able to do smart reasoning about them. Right? So we saw this, for example, with the AlphaGo success. And the most important thing about the AlphaGo success was they did a product called AlphaZero. This is a subsidiary of Google called DeepMind, where they learned how to beat from zero principles in roughly 5 days. Right? It's an extraordinary achievement. So it shows you that if we can get the formula right, we can begin to advance knowledge very quickly in probably initially targeted areas and then eventually in general intelligence.
And what would you fund?
I'm a data scientist, so luckily I don't have to worry about that kind of stuff.
And I would do whatever Carnegie is doing, but I would fund, if I could pick one thing, because it actually would lead into the practical applications you just talked about, is tell me the origins of life.
I would make a robot that cooks dinner for you. You know, whatever. Either way.
Okay. Eric, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
We deeply appreciate it.